Hi, everybody, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, the podcast where every week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura.
And I'm Tom.
And Tom is taking episode number 2 today. So before we get into all that, we just wanted to chat for a few minutes. So, Tom, how has your week been? Anything going on?
Week was actually pretty good. As we record this on a Sunday night, Friday could have been better, but Saturday made up for it. It was always the little day trip down to Baltimore, which is always kind of fun, and saw a game, and that was pretty cool. How's your week been, Laura?
It was all right. It was a little crazy at work. I had 2 new staff starting this week at my job, and just onboarding and training them has been a little hectic, but they're great so far. So we're excited to have them. It's just a lot, when you first start for them, for us. So that's been keeping me busy during the week, and had a good weekend so far. Spent some time with family and friends yesterday, and I have a really busy September and October coming up. So I'm trying to get as much downtime in as I can before those 2 months really get crazy. September is a big birthday month, for my family and friends, and I have my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, so we have a party coming up for that, and just other stuff coming up in October. So looking forward to it, but just trying to ease through these last couple of weeks of August. So yeah.
Congratulations to them.
Yes, yeah, it's a long time. There were certainly some rockier times, but they're really good for each other. So it's sweet to see that. But not everybody makes it that long, so that's good.
Nope. Unfortunately, nope.
Yeah, so me and my brother are keeping busy planning for that party. So should be a good time though. But all right, anything else before we get into it?
No, I don't think so.
All right, so why don't you tell us the topic and dive right into it?
All right, so this is a topic that it sort of intertwines a lot of different things, and it's something that's always kind of interested to me. If you follow hockey, if you love hockey, you probably heard this story before, or you probably know it's been there's almost kind of a mythology around it. If you are a fan or know of a certain Canadian band, that has its own mythology about it that kind of intertwines with this. You probably know about this too. It also intertwines with a very other kind of famous or infamous staple of Canadian culture, what's become almost synonymous with Canada, for better or for worse. And that's all kind of intertwined with this story. So this is the story of Bill Barilko. And Bill Barilko was a defenseman for the Toronto Maple Leafs in the late 40s and the early 50s. He scored arguably one of the biggest goals in franchise history at the time, maybe even ever. And he was on top of the world in the summer of 1951, which made what happened after that so puzzling and so tragic.
I am somewhat of a hockey fan. I have never heard of this story in particular, but I kind of stick with the Philadelphia Flyers are my team, for better or worse, and they certainly have been worse lately. So I've kind of not even been watching them as much. But so that's my extent of hockey knowledge is pretty much the Flyers franchise history, and that's about it. So
Well, and this happened long before the Flyers were even in existence. Basically, our story starts. He's born in 1927 in Timmins, Ontario. And Timmins, Ontario is a small town in Ontario, notable for being the hometown of a lot of players who went on to play in the NHL. Also, the hometown of Shania Twain.
oh,
So,
love Shania Twain. All right.
so there's that. He has a brother. They're part Ukrainian. That's going to be important later on in the story. Like a lot of kids in Canada in the 30s and 40s, they play hockey. So he begins to play hockey, and in 1945, him and his brother Alex are playing for a a junior team in Northern Ontario called the Porcupine Combines.
That's adorable. Love that name.
And basically in July of 1945, as the story goes, Ernie Orlando, who's a Maple Leaf scout, sends a letter about these two brothers that he saw. And the letter said that, as he noted, the two brothers were both, quote unquote, husky lads. In hockey parlance, that means big and thick. So even in the 40s, maybe especially in the 40s, there were, quote unquote, good hockey men, and they were, quote unquote, obsessed with big, thick North American hitting boys. Alex does not go on to a career, but Bill gets signed by the Maple Leafs. He plays his minor league hockey in the Pacific Coast League for a team in Hollywood. And then in 1947, February 1947, he gets the call up. He gets called up to the Maple Leafs. Now,
how exciting, though. Just putting yourself in his shoes, though, just this is your dream, and it finally comes to fruition. That's awesome.
That's the dream. In this time, in post World War II, the NHL is kind of establishing itself. In the 20s, the 30s, even into the early 40s, pre World War II, there were teams all over the place. Philadelphia had a team. The original Ottawa Senators actually won 2 cups in the early 20s. The first American team to actually win a Stanley Cup was the Seattle Metropolitans in the 1910s. The New York Americans are a team that's playing, or one of 2 teams in New York. They're actually sharing Madison Square Garden with the Rangers at the time. As the story goes, or as the legend goes, that the Rangers basically kicked them out of the Garden. The owner of the Americans said that the Rangers at this time would never win another cup in his lifetime. And boy, did that turn out to be present. But that's a whole nother story for another time. But by this time in the late 1940s, the NHL has basically congealed itself into what would be called the original 6 era. The 6 teams that basically survived the first couple decades and would basically become the foundational partners of teams of the league: the Boston Bruins, the New York Rangers, the Chicago, the Detroit Red Wings, and the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Maple Leafs. So when the Barilko gets called up, he's playing Montreal, and this is a big deal. Montreal and Toronto, they are called the forever rivals for a reason. It is a very passionate rivalry. It's a rivalry that for most of their lifetime divided a country. If you were from Quebec and you were very proud of your French heritage, you loved the Canadians, and you idolized players like Elmer Locke, and eventually later on around this time, Maurice Rocket Richard, who was revolutionizing the game at this point. If you were from Ontario West, you loved the Maple Leafs in all likelihood, and players like Ace Bailey and Sil Apps. And so he plays his first game in February of 1947. Next game, he scores his first goal, which is a big deal for him. He's a defenseman.
His second game in, he scored his first goal.
Scored his first goal.
Wow. As a defenseman, too, nonetheless.
As a defenseman, and this is at a time in the late 40s where defensemen were defenders. They did not score goals. They did not score a lot of goals.
So can I ask a stupid question?
Sure.
Is this is obviously pre-helmets? Is it padding? Did they have any kind of protective gear on? Anything like that?
This is the era where players died on the ice.
Oh, God. Okay. Good to know.
This all kind of ties into part of the story. For example, the first goalie to wear a mask does not come until about 15, 20 years after this.
Wow.
Into the late 50s, into the 60s. And that was actually Jacques Plante for the Canadiens, who was the first one to wear a mask. Before that, they did not wear masks or helmets. So Bill Barilko plays in 18 games for the Maple Leafs that year. He plays in 11 playoff games, and the Maple Leafs win the Stanley Cup in 1947. In fact, the late 40s into the early 50s is kind of a golden age for the Maple Leafs. They win 3 straight Stanley Cups from 1947 to 1949.
That's awesome.
Bill Barilko is actually a big part of it. He has I believe his best offensive year in 1949, 1950, where they don't win. They lose to Detroit. Now, technically, there's another great story in there about, and I can go on with this for hours. There's another great story in there about how Maple Leaf Gardens, the legendary venue where the Leafs played for years and years and years, despite the Leafs not making the final in 1950, hosted Stanley Cup final games. And that involves the Rangers and being kicked out of Madison Square Garden because Madison Square Garden had a contract with the circus that had precedence.
So the circus had well, I guess back then that makes sense.
So the circus got to be at Madison Square Garden. The Rangers played the entire Stanley Cup final in 1950 on the road.
How do you feel about that, being a Rangers fan?
It very much sums up the franchise post World War II. They played 7 games. They lost in 7 games. They led twice by 2 goals in Game 7 and lost in double overtime.
Man, that feels right.
That's another podcast episode that's called "The New York Rangers Are a Psychological Torture Experiment."
I think you would love to do that one. Yeah. We gotta put that one on the books.
But I digress. So in 1950-51, the Leafs come back. They have a great season. And Bill Barilko is another part of it. He scores another 6 goals. And they make it back to the Stanley Cup final. And they play the Montreal Canadiens. And this
set up that rivalry, that Canadian rivalry right there.
This is a big deal. This is a very big deal. And this is a very big deal even today. This is a big deal for the fans. So when Bill Barilko is playing in this Stanley Cup final, he's playing with some fantastic players. On that Toronto team, Ted Kennedy, Max Bentley.
Ted Kennedy, the senator?
Not Ted Kennedy, a different Ted Kennedy.
Okay, different Ted. Okay.
That would have been a hell of a trick.
Right? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
Just some fantastic names. Turk Broda, the goaltender. Fern Flaman is
Flaman. That's
or Fern Flamon, maybe that's how you pronounce it.
I like that name a lot.
The 4 names I gave you were all ended up being in the Hall of Fame.
Awesome.
So they're playing Montreal, and this Montreal team is about poised to become a machine. This Montreal team has just legendary talent that I'll get into later, but they play the Stanley Cup final, and it gets to a Game 5 where Toronto is winning 3-1, 3 games to 1, and it gets to overtime.
Can I, again, sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
So does it still follow the same playoff structure as like best of 7, or was it different back then?
So it was because, and this kind of gets into another kind of piece of the lore, I guess, so to speak. So back then, only 4 of the 6 teams made the playoffs. And you played 2 series. We needed 8 wins. And this is why in the 90s, this is why it became popular for fans in Detroit to throw octopuses or octopi onto the ice. Because
is that where that originated from?
That's where it originated from, because the 8 legs of the octopi symbolized the 8 wins you needed at the time to win the Stanley Cup.
That makes sense.
It does.
Thank you for that. Never knew that.
It's interesting. Disgusting, but interesting.
Yeah, I'm not an octopus fan, so.
No. So it gets to overtime, and there's a shot that the Canadiens goaltender stops, but it comes out for a rebound, and Bill Barilko, on a backhand while diving in midair, backhands the puck behind McNeil, the goaltender, and he lives the dream of dreams. He scores the Stanley Cup winning goal in overtime. And if you love hockey, if you played hockey, that's that's what you dreamed of doing. If you, just like some people dream of scoring the winning touchdown in the Super Bowl, that's, if you play hockey, you dream of scoring the Stanley Cup winning goal in overtime, and Bill Barilko got to do it.
Is there any video footage of that goal?
There is no video footage, but there is an amazing picture. I will try to send it in chat. It's an incredible photograph. It's basically it's the goalie just with a pained look as Bill Barilko is literally just skates in the air on his knuckles pretty much as this puck is going in.
Like, that's like a once in a lifetime shot. Like, that's crazy.
It's a once in a lifetime shot, and it's a once in a lifetime moment, which makes this all the more incredible,
Mm-hmm.
and it makes it all the more just wild that this happens. So
Oh my goodness, that's crazy.
And you also see how they played. There was little to no padding.
No,
there were no helmets. It was Thunderdome.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like their knees are protected, but that's about it. And their hands, I guess, but
that's about it. And that's also, it was not uncommon for them to be chasing around each other, swinging sticks at each other's heads.
This photo is incredible. I will definitely add it to our visuals on Instagram. This is really cool.
It's an incredible photograph, and it's really, and it's beautifully shot, just beautifully shot. And basically this happens at home in Maple Leaf Gardens. The crowd goes wild. The news reports say that, the crowd rushes the ice, and Bill Barilko is basically carried off the ice on his teammates' shoulders. The news report in the Toronto Star the next day wrote that it was as clean as a hound's tooth, which is very 1950 newsy speak. You imagine it coming from a guy with one of those snap top,
like the Jeff cap things, yeah.
Snap top tap, and with a paper cut that said press on it, card that said press on the top. But he's immortalized, and it's considered at the time, one of the most iconic goals, especially in Maple Leaf history, but it's at the time in hockey history. Mm-hmm. So he wins this cup. This is in May. And back then, like with a lot of athletes in the off season, you worked a day job. So he worked a job in Toronto, and he also loved to go hunting and fishing. And he would go back to Timmins and visit with his parents, and that's where this story turns.
Did you say where he worked?
I think he owned a company in Toronto. I believe.
Okay. Do you know what? I'm just so curious what it was, or
to be honest, I don't know.
Okay. Sorry. I'm so
right.
curious. Go ahead.
So we get to now August of 1951. So there's one of the town dentists, Henry Hudson, no relation as far as I'm concerned, as far as I'm aware, has a plane, and he's a pilot, and he volunteers to take Bill Barilko out to a town called Rupert House, Ontario, which is up in the northern part of the province, up in what's called cottage country.
So very rural, I imagine.
Very rural, lots of woods, lots of lakes.
Good for hunting.
Good for hunting, good for fishing, good for cottages on the lakes. If you've ever seen a tweet from a Canadian hockey writer that says on July 2nd, I'm going up to the cottage, they're going heading up that way. So they left on Friday, August 24th for this was going to be the first time Barilko was flying somewhere to go fishing. As the story was told in Toronto Star back in 2017, his mother, Bill Barilko's mother, actually pleaded with him not to fly. she would tell the Star later that she had a premonition something would happen.
I was thinking that she had some kind of premonition or
Well,
intuition that something was going to
so
happen.
the
Yeah.
story goes that she later told the Star that her husband had died on a Friday 5 years earlier, and she didn't want Bill to quote unquote take a chance at anything on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
And I told him that she would say that I told him I would rather die than see him take this trip. Bill Barilko, who had a bit of a wild streak and had a bit of a reputation for taking chances, supposedly laughed at his mother, said he was going to be fine.
Ugh.
And the mom was so angry, she refused to kiss him goodbye. That's as the story is told. So they leave Porcupine Lake on August 24th. They fly to Rupert House to fish. They fish for 3 days. They made it there. The last time they're seen is on August 26, 1951. They are gassing up in Rupert House to fly back to Porcupine, to fly back to Timmins. And that's where the story turns.
Mm-hmm.
Because they never make it back to Porcupine.
Oh, no. How long was the flight, do you know?
I don't know how long the flight was. They were flying in a very light private plane called it's called the Fairchild 24. It was a single engine plane. Supposedly, as the story goes, there were bad storms, very strong headwinds that day.
Mm-hmm.
The dentist, who was also a pilot, was an experienced pilot, but he had also had problems. He had problems flying up this way before. He had run into strong headwinds. He had run into strong storms and had problems flying through this terrain.
I mean, that's no joke. You want to fly through that shit.
No, and that you don't want to fly through that shit. That should be, that should be the motto. But basically, he never comes back. They're wanted to realize that he's missing. There was a 2-month undertaking to find him, what would become basically the biggest aerial search in Canadian military history.
Mm-hmm.
38 planes, 270 personnel. They searched an area that was estimated to be about 78,000 kilometers.
Mm-hmm.
Without finding anything.
And it sounds like it wasn't an easy area to search either.
Well, and the area between where they took off and where they landed was almost a very nondescript, generic, indistinguishable bog.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a complete maze of growth and forest and trees and bushes, and
so it's almost like a needle in a haystack. That's what I'm picturing.
Yeah, and a swamp underneath.
Oof.
So basically, you're looking for a needle in a haystack, essentially. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
When at some point they're searching 78,000 kilometers at a height of 500 feet. So basically they're literally right above the ground, searching through this muck.
Mm-hmm. And you can imagine at the time, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like the search and rescue technology wasn't great yet.
Well, you have to remember this is 1951.
Right, right.
So the search and rescue, you're right, and it wasn't something that it was very hard to get to by foot.
Mm-hmm.
This was almost, this was almost impenetrable by foot.
Mm-hmm.
So all in all, they search for 2 months, and they do not find him, and they do not find Dr. Hudson. It is as you can imagine, everyone is in shock and disbelief and distraught.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's their star player,
He had become a very important player, and he was a player that had scored an extremely important goal. And In fact, the team is so distraught that in the fall, when they start training camp, they still leave all his equipment in his locker, expecting him to show up.
How heartbreaking.
He never does. One of the stories told as well is that one of his cousins basically goes to the airport every day, seeing all the planes land, waiting for him to come back, waiting for a plane that never came back. As this tragedy happens, the team has to move on. At the time that the search is finally called off, it costs about $385,000 Canadian. And back in 2017, the Star estimated that'd be about $3 million Canadian in present dollars, making it at the time, again, the most expansive and most expensive search in the history of the Royal Canadian Air Force. As you can imagine, you can imagine why. And so the team moves on. In, I guess, a twist of fate, over the following years, the team does not win another Stanley Cup.
Do you think it affected the other players' morale? I mean, it had to. At least that first season, you know?
I mean, it definitely had to that first season. There were other factors. And a big part of the other factor is that after that 1951 final, the team that they beat basically started about a 3-decade run as a machine. It's over the 50s, to a lesser extent the 60s, and more so the 70s, that the Canadians become the Canadians. The whole aura around the Montreal Canadian franchise is really in a lot of ways built in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. In the 10 years between 1952 and 1961, they win 5 Stanley Cups in 10 years.
Wow, that's impressive.
They also go to the Stanley Cup final 3 other times. So basically, in a 10-year span, they win 5 cups and go to the Stanley Cup final. They basically, 8 of the 10 finals that happen in a 10-year span involve the Montreal Canadiens.
Very impressive, yeah.
Time where their advantage is having a pipeline to the best talent in Quebec starts to pay off. This is where the aura of the Canadiens and the idea of them as the machine, the Le Glorieux, begins to build when they have players like Bernie Boom Boom Geoffrion, Doug Harvey, Maurice Richard, Rocket Richard, eventually his brother, Henri Richard, the Pocket Rocket, Jean Beliveau, Jacques Plante. These are legends. These are Hall of Famers. And they were all on the team at the same time. They hoarded the best players. They win 5 straight Stanley Cups at a point in the 50s. They win a couple more in the 60s. They really build a dynasty in the 70s later on with Kenny Dryden and Guy Lafleur and Larry Robinson, but that's later on. And all during this time, the Leafs are just kind of there. They don't win another Stanley Cup during that time. The Leafs only make 2 finals during these 10 years, and they lose both.
Still no idea what happened to him.
There's still no idea what's happened to him. By this point, the Leafs, after bottoming out, finishing dead last in the league in 1958, hire their famous coach, Punch Imlach. The names here are just phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah.
But in 1962, they finished second in the league. They win 37 of their 70 games. And with George Armstrong as their captain, they win the Stanley Cup. They win in 6 games over the Chicago Blackhawks, their first Stanley Cup since 1951. And that's important because about 5 weeks later, in early June of 1962, there's a helicopter pilot who is flying over this wooded terrain about 75 kilometers north of a town called Cochrane, Ontario. And he notices he just happened to catch out of the corner of his eye some glinting metal among thick black spruce. This is how it was described in the news reports.
Mm-hmm.
At first, he does not think anything of it, but he eventually reports it. And on June 6th of 1962, a search party treks 2 kilometers into this bush until they find a plane wreck. They find this small plane. When they find it, the wings are torn off, and the cabin is partially burned. They found fish remains in a smashed pontoon. And most importantly, and I'll put a trigger warning here, they find 2 skeletons still trapped in the seatbelt.
Oh, good God.
5 weeks after they had finally won a Stanley Cup and 11 years after he scored his goal, they had finally found Bill Barilko.
Wow.
They found him literally still strapped in his seatbelt. They found his skeleton literally still strapped in his seatbelt.
Like, can you imagine, kind of like we talked about last week, just like the terror, like, because you had to know, like, that something was going wrong, and in those last couple seconds or whatever, like, that's so horrific.
It's a horrific event, and it's an extremely sad end. There's an investigation. It's later determined, or they determined, that both Barilko and Dr. Hudson were killed on impact.
Mm-hmm.
There's still, at the time, they still don't really know what exactly happened.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do they know specifically what happened to the plane? But
they cited pilot inexperience and bad weather conditions. That was the official cause of the crash, but they didn't know what how the plane actually went down.
So it wasn't like they did the investigation, they saw any evidence of like engine failure or anything like that.
No, I mean, they did not see that. I mean, you have to remember too, by the time they found this plane,
True, yeah,
it was 11 years later.
Mm-hmm.
When they finally found the plane, which just speaks to how hard it was to find it where it landed. The official causes of the crash given are pilot experience and bad weather conditions.
Mm-hmm.
It later comes out that this doctor, as I mentioned before, had some issues flying through this part of Northern Ontario. Specifically, there's a story that comes out later from someone who was supposed to be on the trip. In fact, from a news story from back in 2011 from the London Free Press in Ontario, from a doctor who took over Dr. Hudson's practice, dentistry practice, that he was supposed to be on the trip.
Mm-hmm.
That he had been on a trip with Dr. Hudson flying this type of plane before. And basically, the plane ran out of gas right around this portion of Ontario where he crashed before.
Mm-hmm.
They were able to land, and when they landed, the engine literally caught fire. So he had some issues flying here before.
Mm-hmm.
But he decided to fly without assistance and take Bill Barilko with him. You mentioned the Titanic thing. I will say I think it's probably of some. There's a sadness and also I think a comfort that it happened quick.
Yeah.
At least there wasn't prolonged suffering.
Right. I do have a question. Yeah, I do have a question. So with all this, happened in his history and him being more inexperienced and him deciding to take this trip anyway without any assistance, why do you think that? What do you think it was ego? Do you think it was carelessness? Like why do you think he did that with arguably one of the best hockey players at the time,
Well, I think it was a sense of ego. When you're a pilot, I think you feel like you can fly through anything.
Yeah.
And sometimes that hubris gets the best of you.
Mm-hmm.
There were, I guess, one of the hypotheses was that the headwinds were so strong that the plane basically just ran out of gas.
Mm-hmm.
And so it may have just they may have just gone straight down, or they may have spiraled. Before that, there were a couple of conspiracy theories. The one that was kind of floating around for many, many years, that because Bill Barilko was of Ukrainian descent, that he had basically snuck out to the Soviet Union to teach players, to teach hockey to kids. That was kind of the one conspiracy theory that was floating around, because there's conspiracy theories about everything.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And one thing I never knew about this story was I never knew the order. I wasn't sure if they had found him first and then the Leafs had won in 62, or if the Leafs had won first and then they found him.
Mm-hmm.
So they won, and then 5 weeks later in June they found the plane. Over the years, the plane stays in the bush, in fact, and the story becomes kind of mythologized.
So they don't extract the plane from the crash
They
site?
don't extract the plane. Part of it is it was hard to get to the plane.
Well, yeah.
But it stayed there as a memorial for a very long time. With the passage of years, it fades out of the public consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1992, there's a band out of Kingston, Ontario called the Tragically Hip. And the Tragically Hip kind of have their own mythology, Canadian mythology around them. They're a band that plays festivals at small venues all around the world. But in Canada, there are massive rock stars that played 20,000 seat arenas
Mm-hmm.
and sold out houses. They are a band that, when they announced their final tour, because the lead singer had brain cancer and would later pass away about a year later, the final concert in their hometown, in their adopted hometown of Kingston, was a national event.
Wow.
Broadcast live on the CBC, with Ron MacLean, the longtime CBC Hockey Night in Canada host, hosting from Rio, hosting the concert with massive viewing parties across the country. It's a band that a lot of their songs tell stories of Canadian history. One of their more famous songs is a song called "We Kings," about a gentleman who was wrongly imprisoned for 20 years in Saskatchewan. I think it's either Saskatchewan or Manitoba, for murders that he did not commit. And in 1992, they released a song called 50 Mission Cap. And the song tells the story. The verses go: Bill Barilko disappeared that summer. He was on a fishing trip. The last goal he ever scored won the Leafs the cup. They didn't win another till 1962, the year he was discovered.
So do you think that was some kind of like karma, or like I don't even know what you would call that.
It makes a good story.
It does. It does.
It makes a good story, and what kind of makes this story unique is the blending of so much. When we talk about Americana and Canadiana, I guess would be the word to describe it. So many just blending so many things together, to create this almost kind of mythology around it. And I did not know of the song when I first heard the story. I first heard the story in Toronto when I was a kid, and I was taking a tour of Maple Leaf Gardens before they closed it, and they take you through the little museum they have, and they have this. They had a giant mural of this picture that we're going to put up on our social media, of this famous picture of Bill Barilko scoring the goal, and they tell the cliff notes of the story. And they tell the cliff notes that he disappeared on a fishing trip. They didn't win again until until the year they found him, and that's all you really know. But there were a lot of people who really became, our age and younger, who became aware of the story because of the song, and because the song became popular.
So why didn't they tell the whole story at the memorial? Why is it cliff noted, do you think?
I mean, I think it's because I think it's hard to get into the story. I think
Yeah, because there's
know,
there's a lot of nuance to it.
there's a
Yeah.
lot of nuance to it. There's a lot of moving parts to it, and quite frankly, the Cliff Notes version has its own is a myth unto itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those moments in life that you couldn't possibly write.
Mm-hmm.
As the years go on, they honor Bill Barilko. He becomes one of, at the time until very recently, only 2 players to ever have his number retired by the Maple Leafs.
Mm-hmm.
For the longest time, the Maple Leafs did not retire numbers. They, quote unquote, honored numbers, meaning that there were banners up, but they were not taken out of circulation. This caused a lot of consternation with a lot of the former players. He was one of the 2 to be honored with having his number retired. The
So
other,
what can I ask?
sure,
What was his number?
number 5.
Gotcha.
The only other number that was retired by the Maple Leafs was, I believe, number 6, and that was for a gentleman named Ace Bailey, who was one of their first stars. He also very famously took a check from Eddie Shore that eventually killed him. He was the only other player at the time to have their number retired.
Interesting.
Over the years, they honor the Barilko family. There's a ceremony for them before a playoff game in 2000 where they are presented with a plaque. That the Barilko family is presented with a plaque that has the lyrics of 50 Mission Cap to it, and Gord Downie, the now late great Gord Downie, the lead singer of the Tragically Hip, presents the plaque to the surviving members of the Barilko family.
Oh, I wanted to ask, and you may not know this. Was his mother still alive when they found him, or no?
Yes,
She was. Okay. All
I
right.
believe she was. Yes,
So she was at least able to have closure to what happened to her son. That's
yes.
good. Yeah.
And I may be mistaken on that. If I am, I'm sure we will hear about it in the comments. But I believe she was alive.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, in 2011, they finally moved the plane.
That was my other question. All right.
In 2011, they finally moved the plane. The cousin, the one who was going to the airport every day, waiting for a plane that was never going to come, she is the one that basically is there when they finally move the plane from the growth, along with the dentist who took over Dr. Hudson's practice. They lead this one last expedition to the woods north of Cochrane, Ontario, to bring the plane back to Porcupine
Mm-hmm.
and to bring it back to Timmins. The plan was at the time, and I don't know if they ever followed through with this, but to have a memorial in a museum basically in Timmins as part of the town's centennial, I believe, to basically have it part of their history.
Well, I hope they did. And if there's any Canadians out there that know the answer to that, let us know. If
Anyone who
there's a
lives in
museum.
Timmins, yeah, anyone who lives in Timmins.
Yeah.
Shania Twain, if you live in Timmins, you're
Hit
still
us
in
up.
Timmins. And
Send us an email.
I think Claude Giroux was in Timmins for a while too. Claude Giroux, if you're in
Was
Timmins,
he?
either Timmins or Hearst, I forget which one, but I thought he was in Timmins.
Okay.
If Claude Giroux's in Timmins, let us know if the plane is there. But as the plane is coming back into Porcupine, they symbolically pour water from coffee cups onto the pontoons. And that's significant because the last part of this story is the player who eventually took Bill Barilko's roster spot. He ended up playing most of his career with the Maple Leafs. He played also for Pittsburgh and the Rangers and the Sabres.
Mm-hmm.
He also, ironically, tragically died himself in a car accident while he was still playing. But there are also very few players, very few athletes whose Wikipedia page has a professional career and also a tab for the donut industry. Because this gentleman became infamous or famous for opening a donut shop on London Street in Hamilton, Ontario. So when they poured out the water from the coffee cups, they poured out water from Tim Horton's coffee cups, because Tim Horton Tim Horton was the guy who took Bill Barilko's spot on the Maple Leafs.
Crazy.
And Tim Horton himself was a defenseman from Cochrane, Ontario, when he was a kid who had moved to Timmins.
That's so crazy.
And so you have the reason why the story speaks to me is because you have so many intersections of things that are synonymous with, or become synonymous to me, at least with Canadian, with Canada. Rightly, for better or for worse. Whether it's hockey, the Leafs, Tim Hortons. I think a lot of Canadians at this point probably don't want to be associated with Tim Hortons, but there are so many intersections that make this story so unique. It's the highest of highs and the lowest of lows.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a tragedy in every sense of the word.
And I think that it's a good reminder too that like no matter who you are, no matter how rich you are or successful, like it can be taken away and ended in a second. You know, it's just a good reminder of that, and so sad, such a tragedy.
But it's a story that has kind of built its own mythology. And I keep using the word mythology because that's really the best way to explain it. It's a story with its own lore. It has its own conspiracy theories, and it has this kind of aura, this sad, heavy aura around it because of what happened, but also because this kind of fairy tale of the last goal he scored being the highest moment of his professional career. That basically his last moment on the ice was him doing what everyone had playing the sport dreams of doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's sad and it's tragic, but it's also extremely compelling.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask, how old was he when he died?
23.
Oh my God. So young.
He was 19 when he started playing when he was called up to the Leafs in 1947.
Wow. That's really young. Can you, like, he had his whole career ahead of him. Can you imagine what he could have done with his talent,
Well, and that's, and that's always the tragedy of when people die too young. It's always the what could have been.
Yeah.
No matter what we're all kind of going through in our daily lives, every day is a blessing.
Mm-hmm.
The things that people are dealing with on a daily basis are important things. And we all get so overwhelmed. It's very hard to see the forest for the trees.
And I think too, unless you have like such a personal tragedy happen, or when you lose somebody, really close to you, that it really brings you that perspective,
And understanding that people are struggling with a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm.
But when you start when you're able to start from the premise of every day is a blessing, it just, it can do magical things.
Things tend to get a little bit lighter with that perspective. Yeah. That was really interesting though. Like I said, I've never heard that story. I wish more Americans did know that story. I feel like it's more of a Canadian story.
It's a very much, it's a if you know type of story.
Mm-hmm.
And why I kind of prefaced it by saying, if you follow the sport, if you follow the Leafs, you probably know the story in your sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's part of the mythology.
Mm-hmm.
The same way that not winning a cup in 50 years is part of the mythology at this point.
Right.
The same way that going 20 years without winning a playoff series is part of the mythology at this point. The same way that losing to a Zamboni driver who works for you is part of the mythology. And that's going to be another episode.
Can't wait to hear that one. Yeah.
So, but that's the story of Bill Barilko. And guys, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, if there's anything we missed, or if there's anything I missed, I should say, hit us up on our socials and let us know what you think.
I'd love to hear what you guys think about the story. Thoughts, comments. Yeah, definitely let us know. Let us know what you think. That was fascinating. I love stories like this. And kind of like, again, what I said last week about the Titanic, it's, I don't know, you have to you have to be mindful that lives were lost, but it's still a very fascinating story. And I think it's something to learn from for sure. So
Absolutely.
thank you, Tom. That was really great. So next week I will be back with another episode. I think you guys are gonna like it. It's a little bit lighter, I want to say, than what we've covered so far. So yeah, definitely check us out next week. I do want to ask you, Tom, have you had a chance to see Barbie or Oppenheimer yet?
I have not done Barbenheimer.
No, me
I have
either.
I have not done Barbenheimer, but I heard you have to do Barbie first.
Barbie hit what 1 billion in sales today or something. I thought I saw something like that.
All
So
because of the executives. Somewhere David Zasloff is sitting there going, "It's all I did this. I who do you think you are? I am."
Another ego.
Yes.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining us this week. So you can email us at the tellmeaboutpodcast@gmail.com or hit us up on Instagram at the Tell Me About Podcast. Like I said, we'll put up some visuals. Definitely send us comments, questions, suggestions. We definitely want to hear what you guys want to hear about. So we will see you then. All right. Any last words?
Barbenheimer.
All right. Have a good week, guys.